Hi, I'm Dr. Jodie Klein-Schaefer, and today I'm going to talk to you about how I use the peer review tool in Interact 2 to scaffold an assessment for postgraduate market research students. Basically, as part of the assessment, students had to identify a problem, design a research project, and then design a research instrument. And I wanted students to have an authentic experience of pilot testing that. Today I'm going to tell you about how I set out to use the peer review tool, how I went about doing it, beginning with illustrating the process in theory and then moving on to what it looked like in practice. I'm going to reflect on how well it worked and what I learned, and then I'm going to give you some pointers to help you sort of if you wanted to go about setting it up yourself, if you wanted to give it a go. Basically, I wanted students to design a questionnaire. I wanted them to think about the theory that they'd learned in class. I wanted them to then put that into practice and design a questionnaire based on the problem they'd identified. Then I wanted them to have this final questionnaire that they could then pass out for people to have a look at in sort of a pilot test kind of scenario. I wanted them to be able to pilot test it with class members like you would sitting in class and hand it out to fellow students, but in the online environment. I wanted them to have the experience of getting students to complete it, giving them some feedback as they had the same kind of theory to base their feedback on. The feedback would be about the instrument, if it made sense and flowed, whether there are any problems, and it was an opportunity to engage with peers and benchmark their work. The feedback would be based on theory they'd learned in class, through online meetings, through the lectures that I'd provided, and through their independent reading. So each person had the same sort of basic information to work from that they could then report on evaluate the questionnaires they were seeing. I wanted each student to be able to provide feedback to 3 other students based on the questionnaires that they'd developed. And I also wanted students to be able to receive feedback from 3 other students. So this is exactly what I wanted to have happen. I wanted people to have that two-way flow of information. The answer was the Interact peer review tool. It would collect the submissions from each of the students over a 1-week period. At the end of that 1-week period they closed. Then it would allocate those submissions to 3 students who would evaluate it over a 1-week period, at which time the evaluations would close. And finally it would return the evaluations, 3 evaluations to each student at the end of the week. Now I could monitor it all from Interact 2 on my computer. I could see who had submitted. You can see who's completed. I could see who was in the process of doing their evaluations and who had completed them and who hadn't started, and I could see who had done some evaluations for who. So I could get a sense of what was happening in the groups. Now, what did submissions look like in reality for the students? Basically, students clicked on the peer review tool and they had to go in here to this view complete assessment. Then they had to click on this red question 1 here and go in over a 1-week period and submit a link through this box, submit a link to their questionnaire. Now it might have been a PDF, it might have been through SurveyMonkey, however they chose to do it. Now once that was done, what did evaluations look like? So students would go in here and click on this link provided by students in the submission section. Then they would evaluate it using these 4 criteria. Now they were set up in Interact 2, but I couldn't show you that. And then this is the kind of feedback that the students would receive from their peers. This is what that looked like. And they would receive that 3 times. Now overall I think it worked really well. Students just got on with it. And interestingly, there were no complaints, there were no questions about how to do it, and there were no comments that were either positive or negative. So based on the premise that no news is good news, it worked pretty well. It was a useful tool for achieving what I wanted. It would be interesting to try allowing the students to provide marks for one another, which I didn't. Okay, so how well did it work? You had to be careful that you built in enough time for students to submit and evaluate prior to the submission of their final assignment in the scaffolding terms. It was useful for getting students started. In my case, it helped them to refine one part of their work, but I had to be careful not to get the cart before the horse, because students tended to design the questionnaire before they justified why they made those choices. Probably the main problem I found was that there was no way to manually alter the groups or reallocate students. So if people missed the submission date or there were extensions, which there inevitably are, I had to do a bit of manual handling to manage that. I chose to pair those up who couldn't make those times external to the tool. So if you want to use this, think about what it is you want to achieve in your assessment. If you want students to be able to provide considered feedback to one another based on what they've learned, it's a useful tool. It fits nicely with the KPI 11, which is that peer-to-peer learning, and you can choose for students to be anonymous or not, and I think there could be some really clever applications. Now, how would you make this happen if you wanted to do it? I would encourage you, once you've decided what you want to achieve, to work with an ED. I had wonderful support from Sharon Arrow in refining the assessment and working out the details such as submission and evaluation and end dates. Just those little fine details about what criteria you'd use, setting the criteria up in the tool, that sort of thing is useful to have an ED. Now, this is an example from the QLT blog, this peer assessed comment is about an example of another cohort of 400 people, sorry. So it's a blog post giving you an example of how another staff members used it, which might be useful because I only had a small cohort. So to recap on what I did, basically, the assignment gave students the opportunity to engage with their peers, to benchmark their work against others in the cohort, and to apply the theory that they'd learned. Also, as I mentioned, the thing that I wanted was it gave them an authentic experience of seeing what it's like to have someone unfamiliar with their project complete their assessment, complete their questionnaire. Now, I'd be really interested to hear from anyone else that's used this tool, the peer review tool, and how you've used it. And I'm also really happy to chat about my experience.